Hello, everybody. My name is Harold Trinkunas. I'm the Deputy Director at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University. It's my pleasure today to welcome Abe Denmark uh, to talk about his new book, U.S. Strategy in the Asian Century. Abe is at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C., where he is the director of their Asia program and a senior fellow in the Kissinger Institute on the United States and China. He also teaches at Georgetown University and in a previous life served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia. So I think obviously a very rich background with which to talk to us about his views on U.S. strategy in the Asian century. Abe, why don't you take it away?
Great. Thank you so much, Harold, for hosting. Thank you to Stanford University, CSAC, for hosting me. This is a project many years in the making. My editor would say too many years in the making, but it's just thrilling to be able to join all of you. When I'd envisioned this, the book tour as sort of motivation to finish the project, I had visiting Stanford as a high priority for me. As a Colorado native, I'm legally obligated to visit Stanford and visit whatever shrine to John Elway you may have up there at the time, but also just because of the tremendous work that's being done at CSAC and the terrific scholars that you have. And I'm just very grateful to all of you for having me. I'm going to initially present the book's primary arguments as a way to tee up a discussion. It's going to be organized a bit differently from the book, and I'll just be trying to hit the main points of the argument. And as a first stop, just as a key caveat that these views I'm presenting, the views of the book, are mine alone, not those of the publisher, Columbia University Press, or of the Wilson Center, or of the US government. So the book has four core arguments, and it tries to advance the discussion on what the United States is doing in the Indo-Pacific and what we should be trying to accomplish. And the first argument is to try to define what the United States and China are competing about. That based on the argument that the Trump administration, I think, did do something that's fairly helpful for those of us focused on Asia, in that it made US-China competition far more explicit than it had been previously, and really called out those dynamics that had been evolving and emerging for quite some time before then. And that's quite helpful to call that out, I would say, that make explicit the competitive dynamics of the relationship. But what they haven't done, and what the US has not come to a consensus on yet, is what the US and China are actually competing about, which to me is a pretty important aspect of this new consensus. That some see it as a competition over military advantages, some see it as a competition of ideology. But what the book argues is that fundamentally the US and China are competing over two aspects, power and order. And I'll be explaining what that means and the implications of that argument later in this presentation. The second core argument to the book is that the regional balance of power has been shifting with the rise of China, with the rise of other countries in the region, as well as with deepening uncertainties about the reliability of American power, as well as its sustainability. And the book argues that those shifts are threatening the foundations of the region's post-war liberal order. And it calls for the United States to evolve its strategy towards the region to account for these changes, to account for the fundamental dynamics of US-China competition in a way to revitalize liberal order for the 21st century, and really emphasizing the role that US allies and partners must play in any strategy for the United States going forward in these different areas. So let me talk the first aspect of what I see as undermining confidence, undermining the established post-war liberal order. First being uncertainty about the United States, both the sustainability and the reliability of American power. Now, this is, I think, true in the views of US allies and adversaries alike, that there's the sense that economic challenges, budgetary pressures, is limiting or potentially putting a cap on the sustainability of American power abroad. But I think more significantly is the reliability, perceptions of the reliability of American power. Seeing the United States as increasingly prone to strategic distraction, having been fighting wars in Iraq and Afghanistan for several years, as well as deepening questions inside the United States, inside our own politics, about the role of the United States in the world. And the book argues that these trends have been going on for quite a long time, but they've been exacerbated by several events. I already mentioned the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but the 2008-2009 financial crisis greatly raised concerns and questions about American power. And there were lots of debates about American decline, with Joseph Nye, among others, talking about absolute versus relative decline. But more recently, these concerns have been raised by the Trump administration's foreign policy and its skepticism about the role of US alliances, skepticism about the United States playing a leadership role in the world, as well as the COVID-19 pandemic, raising questions about the effectiveness of the United States and its willingness to lead an international response. I think all have been exacerbating international questions about the sustainability and reliability of American power. And this comes at the same time and is certainly related to the rise of China. And the book spends a great deal of time talking about the implications of China's rise, trying to answer the question, what does China want with its rising power? What is China trying to improve? And the book goes through this by using authoritative sources from inside China, and basically argues that what Xi Jinping has said is that China is trying to achieve what he refers to as the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And I'll talk a bit about that, what that means in particular momentarily. But the argument for the United States is that as we're competing with China, this is going to be a country unlike any other competitor that we've seen before. That its foreign policy is primarily motivated by deep domestic concerns that China's leadership has, as well as by the unique history and ideology of the Chinese Communist Party, both of which shape and inform its approach to international affairs and to its own national security. At the same time, the book argues that China is taking what it calls an exceptionalist approach to international order. And let me explain briefly what that means. Some have argued that China is a revolutionary power trying to overthrow the established order. But the evidence doesn't really support that yet, in that China has been trying to change aspects of the international system, but it is not trying to replace or dismantle the international system wholesale. In that there are aspects of China's foreign policy that are quite supportive of the established international order, be it the UN, other international institutions. But what China does try to do and has been trying to accomplish in its foreign policy has been to carve out exceptions for when it finds the established order to be contrary to the interests and desires of the Chinese Communist Party. In that, a good example of this is China's approach to freedom of navigation in international waters. That China's military ships sail close to the islands and shores of many other countries, including the United States, Japan, several others, without problem, because this is, it's right under international law, under established international law. Yet when other countries do the same thing close to islands and features that China claims, China reacts very strongly. And in my experience, when asked about this, Chinese officials, Chinese scholars will reiterate China's deep support of freedom of navigation as a principle, but also note that these issues, when it comes to Chinese islands and Chinese claimed islands and features, are especially sensitive, and therefore we need to be especially careful there, carving out an exception for themselves. Similarly, in international institutions, China claiming to be still be a developing nation, even though it's the second largest economy in the world, again, pointing out that China is a special case and therefore deserves special treatment in international institutions. And the way the book describes this is that it's a different sense version of exceptionalism, that it's a different form from, say, American exceptionalism, which is based on the belief that the United States has a special role to play in the world because of our ideals, our ideology. Whereas for China, it's more of a civilizational understanding of exceptionalism, that China is special because it's China, and China deserves exceptions to established orders, laws, and norms because it's China, and it's a special case. And part of its approach is therefore, although China's rhetoric will talk a lot about sovereignty and the equality of nations and international democracy, China's approach also implicitly rejects a notion of sovereign equality among nations. There are large countries and there are small countries, there are special countries and there are less special countries, and that's just the way the world works, is a way that that China's foreign policy is increasingly looking. So there's no unified authoritative statement from China about what they would like to see the international system become. But the book tries to cobble one together using a variety of sources, making the argument that what China seeks for the international system is to put China at the center of an informal, hierarchical international system in which China is regionally dominant, globally influential, and any major question or issue of strategic consequence for the region and for the world would have to go through Beijing. When one talks with Chinese officials and Chinese scholars, one of the phrases that one hears a lot is hebutong, or harmony, not uniformity. And we can get into the origin of that, if there's some Confucian's origins to that, but basically what it means is that is noting that there's a difference between harmony and uniformity. It means that someone should pursue harmony rather than uniformity. But what this means in diplomatic speak, breaking through the jargon, is that in Beijing's view, China does not seek to explicitly dominate international relations, but only to ensure that the rest of the world can live in harmony with China as it pursues its interests. And there's a terrific example of this phenomenon a few months ago, when the Chinese ambassador to the United States appeared on Fareed Zakaria's show on CNN, where Dr. Zakaria pressed the Chinese ambassador on several issues, I think very effectively, related to Uyghurs in Xinjiang, China's violation of one country, two systems in Hong Kong, its recent assertiveness in the South China Sea. And the Chinese ambassador said, and I'll quote him here, quote, "The fundamental question for the United States is very simple. Is the United States ready or willing to live with another country with very different culture, very different political and economic system? Whether the United States is ready to live within peace and cooperate on so many and still growing global challenges. I think this is a real choice. It's a fundamental choice people have to make." So this is hebutong in action, that China has every right to do what it believes it needs, and that the world must come to terms with that. Second, it assumes that that the United States objects to China's rising power. Again, an important distinction between power and order. And as I mentioned before, China seeks to adjust the international order to reflect the interests and needs of the Chinese Communist Party. And that ultimately what this will mean is both a weakened and more compliant system of international laws and institutions that carves out exceptions for China's interests, but also in terms of power and influence, a more circumscribed role for the United States, especially in the Indo-Pacific. And so because this book is focused primarily on US allies and partners, it tries to take stock of how our allies and partners view these issues and note these and try to navigate these dynamics between the United States and China. So broadly speaking, US allies and partners see China as economically important. For the vast majority of our allies and partners around the world, China is their top trading partner. But this is not translated into geopolitical support, despite Beijing's best interests. Whereas the United States is seen generally positively around the world, though Pew polling suggests that while the United States is still seen as supportive, President Trump is quite unpopular among US allies and partners, with a few exceptions. But despite their concerns about the United States, despite their concerns about President Trump, they continue to look to the United States for leadership. And one sees this in a variety of different ways. The most clear way I've seen this personally in the conference after conference around the world, when there's a series of
Let's give Abe a minute to see if his internet recovers. Okay, let's see if Abe gets back on. I'll send him an email to make sure that he's aware of the problem. Oh, there he is again. Great.
I think my Zoom just died. Am I back on?
Welcome back. I think
Okay.
we might have missed 2 minutes of your talk.
Okay. Sorry about that. I just noticed my camera cut off. I'm not sure why. It's the first time that's ever happened. So where did I leave you?
I would just go back one slide.
Okay.
And then start again.
Okay. Sorry, everybody. That's the first time that's ever happened to me. So the book tries, because it's focused on U.S. allies and partners, it tries to understand the views that our allies and partners have of these dynamics between the United States and China and our competition over power and order. Broadly speaking, and I'll try to move through these points quickly to try to make up some time, our allies and partners see China as economically very important. They're usually the top source of trade for our allies and partners, but this is not translated into geopolitical support. That these countries, as their economic future is increasingly entangled with China, have in fact grown more concerned about the geopolitical implications of China's rise. At the same time, they see the United States positively, though not necessarily President Trump. In fact, while the United States is still seen in Pew polling, still seen very positively, President Trump himself receives quite low marks across most of our allies and partners around the world, with a few exceptions here and there. But what's interesting here is that even though there's deep concerns about American power around the world, concerns about the reliability of the United States, deep questions and disagreements about the Trump administration's policies and views on the rise of China, the world continues to look to the United States for leadership. We are seen as the only country that can credibly push back against China, both in terms of geopolitical power, but also as a attractive power. That these are countries that generally want to see American leadership in the world, especially in the face of China's rise. But the dynamics of U.S.-China competition for most of our allies and partners makes them quite uncomfortable. Especially efforts by either side to get them to choose one side over another, which really flies in the face of their efforts to hedge in an era of such uncertainty. So the book describes what I call the Indo-Pacific's emerging heterarchy, which heterarchy being a overlapping system of multiple hierarchies. The idea that U.S.-China competition is going to occur across all elements of national power, not just military, not just ideology, but all aspects of national power. And that our allies and partners will be watching this complex competition and in some ways picking and choosing how they want to navigate this complexity. In this slide here, we have, so what the book expects is competing mechanisms, competing systems in which one system is dominated by China or the other system dominated by the United States. And here in the slide, we have trade communities, security mechanisms, technology standards, and infrastructure, in which the United States and China in some ways are already developing these separate systems. And what I note here, And the implications of this for US strategy is that we need to have compelling alternatives for China's approach across all of these systems. That technology standards can no longer be seen as the domain of technology experts, but rather as a domain of geopolitical competition. Similarly for a trade community, with the Trump administration pulling us out of TPP, it's unclear what our trade mechanism would be to compete with what China is trying to create through RCEP and BRI and whatnot. Similarly for infrastructure, we have the BDI, we have the Build Act, but not nearly to the same scale as what China has proposed through BRI. And so this drives complex hedging strategies throughout our allies and partners. While most who look at the strategy of our allies and partners see the choices that they have is between being balancing or bandwagoning, aligning with the United States or aligning again with China. The book argues that the strategy that most of our allies and partners are pursuing is actually a mix that includes all elements of these pieces, includes bandwagoning and balancing, both with the United States and without the United States, and internal balancing. Just maximizing flexibility in the face of tremendous uncertainty. And I think this applies for every US ally and partner. We can find elements of these complex hedging strategies. And so the book proposes, after setting up this framework of US-China competition across all elements of national power over the future order of the Indo-Pacific, it presents a framework of how the United States should react. And this part of the presentation is organized quite differently from the book, but for simplicity's sake and for the sake of time, I'll summarize it this way, that it sets three broad objectives for the United States. First, to counteract changes to the regional balance of power. Second, to oppose China's exceptionalist objectives. And third, to sustain liberal principles within the regional order. It takes on for an assumption that the order is going to change. It's going to evolve in line with changes to the regional balance of power, as it has throughout the centuries in the Indo-Pacific. But it does also make the argument that with our allies and partners, we can be in the driver's seat about how the region evolves. And that we can make sure that the region continues to evolve in a way that sustains liberal principles that have been critical to the success of the post-war liberal order. So it identifies several initiatives that the United States should pursue. Broadly speaking, the largest categories would be to first revitalize a 21st century liberal order. This would mean restoring, revitalizing international institutions to make them more effective, to make them more relevant for current challenges. It would mean potentially creating new institutions, new laws and norms, especially in new areas of technological innovation where these places are particularly light, where international norms and laws are particularly thin, that the United States can be a leader in revitalizing 21st century liberal order, and will be more effective if we do so with our allies and partners. Second, to reconceive of competition with China. That is, to have an understanding of what we're trying to compete over. And the book makes a clear argument that we're competing over both power and order. That it's not just military capabilities or GDP or trade volume, but it's all those elements of hard national power, but also how we translate that power into the long-term shape, health, and success of the regions in the international order, whether it will continue to abide by principles of political and economic liberalism, or whether it will devolve into a more atomized, less prosperous, and less stable international order. Third, it calls on the United States to empower allies and partners. And at the core of this is the call to redefine how the United States understands alliances, especially, less as military first mechanisms, but rather as platforms for cooperation and coordination across all elements of national power. And that these alliances and partnerships, despite what President Trump has been saying for the past almost 4 years, are actually tremendous assets for the United States, and something that would be useful both in terms of competing with China, restoring, revitalizing 21st century liberal order, But the other aspect of this, and the fourth category of initiatives, would be that the book describes is to rebuild American geopolitical strength. We've seen efforts by the United States to get our allies and partners to do more in the past, specifically the Nixon Doctrine, in which President Nixon left our allies and partners to defend themselves and only committed the United States to nuclear defense. And the ramifications of the Nixon Doctrine were quite problematic, especially in the Indo-Pacific. And to me, the key distinction between what President Nixon attempted and what the book describes is that this is not a strategy of American retreat or retrenchment from Asia, that it needs to be held in tandem with an effort by the United States to rebuild its geopolitical strength, both at home and in the Indo-Pacific, in terms of reinvesting at the core of what makes America strong and what makes America special, both in terms of necessary and relevant military capabilities, but also in terms of our diplomacy, our economic diplomacy, efforts to build infrastructure across the region, investing in education and infrastructure at home. All of these to me are part of a competitive strategy that is less focused on slowing China down and more focused on speeding the United States up and making ourselves more effective. And that to me is the key difference between what the book suggests and what President Nixon was advocating for. So to sum up, I realize that we need to get to Q&A. This book was finished before the coronavirus pandemic began. And it doesn't mention coronavirus at all. And I thought it was unfortunate that the book didn't really describe it until I heard back from one of the key officials who wrote a blurb for the book, former Deputy Secretary of State, Richard Armitage, who described the book as a handbook for the post-coronavirus world. And that really got me thinking. And eventually I realized that building efforts to coordinate our policies with our allies and partners, to empower them to do more in the region, to cooperate in terms of revitalizing a 21st century order and competing with China, is really exactly what a post-COVID world is going to need. When we get past the Trump administration, be that in next year or in 5 years, things aren't going to just go back to the way they were before. That the world has changed, in part because of the Trump administration, in part because of COVID, in part because the world has just kept moving on. And we can't just go back to the way things were in 2016. That we need to address the region for what it is, we need to address our allies for what they are, and we need to meet our adversaries on the competitive field that they've chosen, which is much more complex than what we're used to during the Cold War. That the book concludes with the sense and analysis that the United States is still best positioned to lead, both in terms of power and international credibility, but we can't do it alone. That our allies and partners are critical assets and for our strategy going forward. And finally, the book ends with analysis of what happens if we don't adopt this strategy. What happens if we don't work more with our allies and partners? And ultimately, what I found is that in different ways, either diminishing the role of the United States or just being more unilateral or just saying that we'll do more without actually doing much more, is that the international region, the question for the region, for the Indo-Pacific region, is not really a question between American leadership or Chinese dominance. There's very little appetite for Chinese dominance in the region. To me, it's a question between continued success of the liberal order under the leadership of the United States as well as its allies and partners, or a more atomized, less stable, less prosperous region with just less order. And to me, the former is certainly much more appetizing than the latter. So I'll stop there. In the book, I try to use the Silicon Valley piece that we hear before, that I expect you all hear a lot more than me, adapt or die. I think we need to adapt. And my hope is that this book helps thinking about how we can adapt for the challenges that we're facing. I'll stop there. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, Abe. That was great. So we already have some questions. I'd encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A section of the Zoom app. Let me get started with the first couple that are related. So I'm just going to ask them both at once, Abe, because they're both related to the situation with the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. So Claude Ezran asks, what could the United States and Europe do to more effectively influence China regarding the way they abuse Uyghurs? And Aaron Carter asks, this is an interesting presentation. Thank you. Historically, human rights have been a major area in US-China relations. Xi Jinping has detained at least 1 million and perhaps as many as 3 million Uyghurs in Xinjiang. Several days ago, Xi said that the CCP policy towards Xinjiang was entirely correct. How should the United States respond to these human rights violations, which some call genocide, given that the Chinese government seems so unwilling to change its policies?
Yeah, thanks for those questions. And Harold, congratulations on saying Xinjiang almost entirely correctly. I thought you did a great job for a non-China person. I wanted to give you some props for that. I think you did a lot better than if I were trying to pronounce stuff from Latin America.
Well, in all fairness, Evan Feigenbaum was a classmate of mine way back when, so I did get to hear about Uyghurs in Xinjiang early on.
I'm sure. So in the past, to answer the questions, in the past, the United States has been quite upfront in discussing human rights issues with Chinese officials, both publicly and privately, and putting them in what for them I expect would be quite uncomfortable positions, having to acknowledge and defend China's indefensible human rights record. We haven't been seeing that in recent years from the president. But I'm sure that there are human rights issues are still being raised. But if we're going to get China to change its approach on Xinjiang, it needs to face costs. And that means, for it to face costs, it means that both the United States, as well as other countries around the world, especially Europe, Japan as well, need to be willing to impose those costs. Primarily, I assume we mean economic costs in terms of some sort of trade sanctions, other sorts of financial penalties. The Trump administration has been doing some of that, imposing some sanctions on Chinese officials, but to really be effective, it needs to be an international response. And one of the unfortunate pieces that comes out of criticizing our allies and questioning their utility is that when we ask them to do stuff, they're less likely to do stuff, especially if it's going to involve costs for them. And let's be clear, if we're imposing economic sanctions on China, it's going to hurt our economies as well as theirs. I'm not saying that's a reason not to do it. I actually think paying costs is okay in the pursuit of our values and the reflection of our interests. But the United States could be leading an international coalition to hold China accountable, both economically, diplomatically, and building an international coalition in various international groups to try to raise transparency and understanding about what's happening in Xinjiang and holding Chinese officials accountable for their actions. But we haven't been doing that. We need our allies and partners if we're going to be able to do that. And it requires us putting our values first in our foreign policy, as well as working with our allies and partners to make sure that we're acting in tandem and presenting China with a united front. And until China faces real costs for their behavior, they really don't have any reason to change. I think you're muted, Harold.
Sorry about that. So I'm pulling the next question out of chat. It's from one of our CSAC postdocs, Melissa Carlson. She says, wonderful presentation. I look forward to reading your book. My questions focus on your conceptualization of US-China competition over the international order as as a competition over post-war liberal principles. But the US under the Trump administration has not been trying to prop up the post-war liberal order, but rather taking steps to undermine it by withdrawing from international organizations and various treaties, among other activities. If Trump is reelected, will the future of the US-China competition over the international order be over post-war liberal principles, or will it devolve into simple competition over hegemony in the Indo-Pacific? How likely is it that a re-elected Trump administration would follow your recommendations and focus on revitalizing the liberal order and reconceptualizing competition with China?
Yeah, it's a great question, Melissa. I think that, I can't say how interested the Trump administration is in my opinions on these things. I think a lot of it would depend on which aspect you're talking about and who you're talking about. While President Trump himself has been quite clear in his skepticism about international laws, norms, and institutions, other parts of the US government have been more willing to embrace aspects of that, be it human rights, be it free and fair trade, be it international law. It's been a bit of a patchwork, but there are aspects of foreign policy under the Trump administration that are still somewhat compatible with aspects of a liberal international order. But I do think that raw calculations of power are more compelling for the current government in the United States, and that even though there isn't a consensus even within the government, in my sense is even within departments of the US government about what we're actually competing with China over, there is a sense, I think, that if it's good for America or if it's bad for China, then it's probably something that has to do with competition. And as sort of a lowest common denominator aspect, I think that a second Trump administration will continue to focus on more on the power aspects of competition, be it in the trade and economic front or in the military front, rather than what we're actually trying to accomplish with those power, with those capabilities. And I think our ability to have a coordinated, sophisticated approach across all elements of national power is going to continually be undermined by a government that is chaotic in its implementation, and with a president who I think fundamentally doesn't buy into a lot of the principles of what was established in US government authoritative documents like the National Security Strategy, National Defense Strategy, the Free and Open Indo-Pacific Strategy, which as I described them is, I think they're, here and there, there's things I could disagree with, but I think overall they're pretty good. I say they're within one standard deviation of the norm. But I just think that it's pretty clear that the president just doesn't agree with aspects of it. And when you have a national strategy that the president doesn't agree with, then you don't have a strategy. And I think that's going to be if there's a second Trump term, I think that's going to be the main throughput, is that there isn't going to be a strategy.
Thanks. Eileen, you asked, are the China ideologies that you describe widely held within the party, presumably the CCP, or is this mainly a Xi perspective and could change if there's a change in leadership?
So it's a great question. There's a lot that we don't know about what's happening inside the Chinese Communist Party. There's a sense, I think, within Beijing, and clearly I haven't been there since in quite a while, so it's hard to say definitively, but that a lot of these trends have started before Xi Jinping came to power, be it Chinese assertiveness in the East and South China Seas. But Xi Jinping certainly has a more aggressive approach to these things. His instinct is to take advantage of opportunities and to press China's interests as he defines them quite aggressively when the opportunities arise. So in terms of these views of what China would like to see in the international system, I think there's still debates happening inside China. There are those in China who would like to see China focus more on internal development rather than causing problems along its periphery. There's those who would like to see a return to less capitalist, more Marxist form of government. There's those who'd like to see internal reforms to make China more liberal. But so far, all those voices have been fairly sidelined. And it's clear that Xi Jinping's opinion is the opinion that matters. And he's been at least able to either convince or overwhelm or force dissenting opinions into hiding. So I think as long as we see China both run by Xi Jinping and ascendant in a geopolitical sense, we're going to continue to see China acting assertively, aggressively, and in the interest primarily of the Chinese Communist Party.
Thanks, Abe. The next question is from TV Paul at McGill University. What are the prospects for the Quad emerging as a powerful alternative to China?
I think there's a lot of promise in the Quad. The book actually talks a lot about the Quad and its potential. I actually think most of the focus on the Quad has been in the military sphere. I think it was Deputy Secretary Began talked about having Australia and Japan invited to the next Malabar exercise. But I actually think that the Quad could do a lot more outside of the military, be it in development assistance, infrastructure development, trade community, technology standards. There's a lot that can be done through those four countries. But there's very little interest, I think, especially on the part of the Indians, for the Quad to be seen as an counter-China sort of formal organization. So when Deputy Secretary Began talked about formalizing the Quad into something like an Asian NATO, I think that raises a lot of allergies inside India, as well as some other countries, as well as some of the other participants, including Australia. There's a lot we can do with them. I think the Quad can help to counter Chinese exceptionalism, to help support international liberalism, but making it explicitly counter China may be counterproductive. I would just let it focus on what we can do together and keep the China piece in the effects rather than in the objectives.
Hey, let me just ask a quick two-finger on that.
Yeah.
Have the Indian and Chinese clashes along the line of actual control changed the conversation at all? I know that's very recent, but I'm wondering if that is affecting maybe some of their thinking, or might affect their thinking on the Quad or other possible ways of counterbalancing China.
I think it's helped with India a bit, in that India has been more willing to engage on things that are more explicitly counter to Chinese interests. But I think a lot of that is also a reflection of the leadership in New Delhi, which is more willing to be explicit in efforts to counter the Chinese. But inside India, I think it's helped draw attention to the challenge posed by China and draw some of the attention away from perpetual focus on questions of Pakistan and Afghanistan. So India is always going to be balancing those dynamics. India is, I've been in too many meetings between Indian and American officials where the American officials will just say, when are you going to get on Team America? That's, I think, not going to happen. India is on Team India. But right now our interests converge, and we're both democracies that have concerns about China, about international laws and institutions. I think there's a lot that we can do together. And the border clash, I think, has sharpened some focus on the Indian side.
Thanks, Abe. The next question comes from Kathy Ann Kowalski. What would be a realistic timeline or timetable for shifting from today's U.S.-Asia relationship to the paradigm you're describing? 1 or 2 presidential terms, longer, shorter?
Yeah. Well, first on disclosure, I suspect that this is the Kathy Ann Kowalski from Cleveland, Ohio, also known as my mother-in-law, just so you're aware. So of course, I think it's the most interesting question I've heard in any of these book talks. Something I used to say during the Obama administration, before I went into the Obama administration even, was that rebalancing to the Indo-Pacific, to the Asia-Pacific as we called it back then, is the task of more than one administration. That this is going to take a lot of time, that we built up our focus on the Middle East and Europe over the course of decades. And shifting our focus to the Indo-Pacific is going to take decades. I think we made some progress during the Obama administration. I think that we've also made some progress during the Trump administration, although not as much as I would have liked to see. But I think it's going to play out over the period of several administrations. And if you look at timelines, in terms of changing our military structure, just to keep in an area of my personal comfort, it takes decades to radically change what our military looks like. And so I think that this is going to be more than the question of 1 or 2 budget cycles, more than the question of one or two administrations, but the logic that drove the rebalance, that the Indo-Pacific is increasingly important for the world and for American interests, is inescapable. It's why the Obama administration pursued rebalancing. It's why the Trump administration focused on the free and open Indo-Pacific. And it's why I expect that any future administration, whatever it may be, we'll also focus on the Indo-Pacific because it's critical to our interests. And that logic is really inescapable.
Thanks. And the next question is from Samuel Nolito. I'm afraid I stole his thunder a little bit. I should have read down before asking my two-finger, because it's on the strains between India and China. I think he's talking a little bit more broadly than the line of actual control. And he notes that India has appeared to be more willing to confront China on a variety of issues. What role do you think India will play in the competition between China and the US? And maybe even if we want to tack on a little bit to this, there's obviously also the Pakistan-China, Pakistan-US relationship, and obviously Pakistan-India, really complex piece of the puzzle. So if you want to take another minute or two on that, I think we have time.
Sure. Now, India, I think, I'm a big believer in India. So my book, about the first half of it, describes the framework that I went through in the presentation today. But really, the second, maybe 40% of the book is a country-by-country analysis of what we could do within this framework with each of these major countries, each of our major allies and partners, including in Europe, but there's also a section on India. So I think India is going to be very important to American interests in the Indo-Pacific. That India can do a lot in terms of helping us compete with China, but also in supporting some of the key principles that are essential to liberal order. And that India wants to play a greater role in the region. That India's leadership now wants to get beyond questions of Pakistan and Afghanistan. And so to me, there's a real alignment of interests as well as values here. Now, I worked for Secretary Ash Carter in the Pentagon, and he is probably the greatest advocate for India in the Obama administration. So, I definitely drank from the Kool-Aid there, and deep believer in India. But we need to be patient. We need to be realistic, and we need to meet India where they are, not where we wish they would be. I'm so glad you asked about Pakistan. Right before the COVID lockdown, I was lucky enough to actually visit Pakistan and meet with some of the key people there. And I just found the whole country just fascinating. Pakistan is facing a lot of challenges. We haven't really done much thinking about what the region looks like after the United States leaves Afghanistan. But it's clear that I expect that it's going to be disastrous for a lot of the people who live there, especially if the Taliban's able to achieve its objectives. Now, Pakistan, a lot of the Pakistan-India rivalry plays out in Afghanistan. And so that's something to watch. The tensions between India and Pakistan have grown increasingly concerning over the past few years. And China has been supporting Pakistan as a naked way to check India and keep India busy. But if you look at what China's objectives are with Pakistan, especially in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative and building infrastructure from China down to avoid the strategic waterways of Southeast Asia, it's pretty unrealistic in that I can't imagine trying to secure oil pipelines, natural gas pipelines, trade routes, whatever it is, through the northern parts of Pakistan. That's going to be tough for anybody. It's tough for Islamabad, let alone for the Chinese. And so my sense, and just my personal sense when I was in Pakistan, is that there's a lot of disappointment that China promised a lot and there really hasn't been as much benefit as they've been hoping for. But they don't really have an alternative at this point. The United States, I think for very good reasons, isn't helping them as much as we had in the past. And so Pakistan really doesn't have much choice other than to engage with China. It's basically the only deal they've got. And so the next administration, whenever that may be coming from the United States, is going to have to navigate all these dynamics. How do we balance counterterrorism interests in Pakistan with our China interests as it relates to Pakistan? I think it's really an open question, but as soon as we ignore Afghanistan, as soon as we ignore these issues, they're going to become a problem again. And I hope that we're able to keep focus on there and make sure that the problems that came about in 2001 are not allowed to reestablish themselves.
Thanks, Abe. We have two more questions and we have about 8 or 9 minutes, so we'll try to make them fast. So the first question is from David Yin. It's and it recalls, I think, something that Henry Kissinger recently commented on, which is how will the U.S.-China rivalry play out? Will it be the same or different from the Cold War? How does the Xi factor play into this rivalry?
Yeah, it's a great question. One of the implicit arguments of the book is to describe how different U.S.-China competition is going to be from the Cold War. That the Cold War was fundamentally ideological and existential, in that neither side believed that it could exist so long as the other side existed. That it was a question, it was a competition over our political futures, and that it was a competition between two largely separate systems. Whereas the U.S.-China dynamic is completely different, in that we're part of the same system. We're deeply enmeshed economically with one another. And our competition is not over the future of our political system. China is not trying to overthrow democracy in the United States. It's not trying to overthrow our political system. And depending on who you listen to in the Trump administration, we're not trying to overthrow the Chinese system either. So the competition is different. The stakes are different, but also the competition is more complex. The Cold War competition was primarily over security, and especially nuclear. Security was a big aspect, a driving aspect of Cold War dynamics. Whereas security competition has not been the driving factor of US-China competition, and nuclear issues especially have been very much on the back burner, in large part because China's nuclear force is so much smaller than that of the United States. So the nature of our competition is entirely different from the Cold War. And so to me, the US-China competition can only be described as a Cold War if you define Cold War down to the point where it's just competition. And the point I was trying to make with this book is that it's a competition unlike anything we've seen, in that it's going to be across all elements of national power, that China is highly technocratic, but also driven by its own unique history and ideology. We completely reorganized our government around the Cold War. If you look at the National Security Act, the establishment of the CIA, the NSA, all of these were created because of the Cold War, because of the threat we saw from the Soviet Union. And we're going to need to adjust again. If we're going to compete effectively with China, we can't use old wine for these new bottles. We need to come up with strategies and approaches that are more relevant to the competitive dynamics that we have with China. And I hope that the book is a way to get us thinking in those new ways and to point to some of the new directions that we need to go in if we're going to be effective in our competition with the Chinese.
Final question from Colin Call here at CSEC. He notes, you mentioned that you had written this book before the coronavirus pandemic, but he asked you to reflect on, is there an opening that the pandemic provides for a US administration trying to push back against China, given the backlash that it's generated against China in Australia, Europe, Africa, and elsewhere?
Yeah, absolutely, Colin. It certainly presents us with an opening. There's tremendous resentment out in the world against the Chinese. The Chinese tried to turn this into a foreign policy win with their mass diplomacy, and it backfired significantly. And so there's very little love for the Chinese in the world right now, especially among our allies and partners. And they know where this virus came from. That all the diplomacy, all the efforts by Beijing to the contrary, there's a lot of resentment. So there's certainly opportunities for the United States to lead and to take advantage of this. One of the frustrations I've had over the past few years has been to watch the United States abandon its leadership. If you recall, the G20 meeting to devise a global response to the pandemic was not called by the United States. It was, and when the bare minimum of leadership in terms of signing a joint statement among the G20, the United States didn't play the role of leader, it played the role of spoiler. If you recall, we refused to sign it because the other partners wouldn't use the term Wuhan virus in the statement. So that to me is a real abdication of international leadership. So I do think there's a tremendous need for the United States to lead. And there's certainly interest not only for the in the world, not only for American leadership, but also for the United States to build on that need, to form international coalitions, to push back against what China's been trying to accomplish, and to secure the health and success of a liberal international order well into the 21st century.
Well, thank you, Abe. It's been a wonderful presentation and discussion, really lively Q&A. We're just about out of time, and I know Colin and I have to roll into another meeting right at noon, but please, on behalf of CSAC, accept our thanks for this terrific talk, and encourage everybody out there to take a look at Abe Denmark's new book. Any final remarks, Abe?
No, I'm just so appreciative of everybody doing this. Thank you to Harold. Thank you, Colin. Thank you, CSAC. I hope I can visit you in person. I still have to do my John Elway ritual sacrifices. And I'm just very grateful to all of you. And thank you all very much. Stay safe, stay healthy.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Abe.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.